Hey everyone, welcome to the Eat to Win show where sports nutrition meets peak performance. Get ready for expert insights, real stories, and tips to help you win with every meal. Let's dive in.
Hello, and welcome to the Winner's Circle and the Eat to Win podcast show. I am Margaret Downs, a registered dietitian who's also board certified in sports nutrition. And we are here to talk about all things sports nutrition and how we help athletes win. Whether you're an athlete or just passionate about nutrition, this is the place to be. Today, we are thrilled to have an incredible guest with us. Joining us is Linda Steinhardt, who is also a board certified sports nutritionist, and she is an expert in athlete eating disorders. She currently works at the Athlete Edge program in Denver, Colorado, and she's going to be sharing her knowledge, especially as it relates to supporting athletes, their body image, managing eating disorders in sport, and her research on collegiate athletes' perceptions of body composition testing. Such important information for all of our athletes, coaches, parents, and all of our listeners. And we're just thrilled to have you here today. Linda, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm super excited and thanks for creating space for this topic.
Such an important topic and one that I know affects all of us working in this population. And there's all these misconceptions probably that athletes are just healthy people, right? And they don't encounter problems. And it's just those of us who worked in the field a long time know that that is not necessarily the case. So we just really are happy to have this very important topic to talk about today. And so we want to just start out and tell us a little bit about, where you are, what you're doing, and a little bit about what got you there and inspired you to work in this particular area of sports nutrition.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually originally majored in marketing. I played college volleyball and a lot of my teammates were majoring in business. And when I was 18, didn't necessarily know what I wanted to do. Worked in an advertising agency actually for about 6 months after college. And I think growing up, I had seen like various forms of disordered eating disorders on teams. And when I got to college, I actually had a really positive experience in college. My team was very anti-diet kind of around food. And I thought it was really just interesting to notice the shift in team cultures and how that impacted people's relationships with food and their bodies. And so realizing I didn't really want to work in marketing in an advertising agency, I actually went back to school and kind of knew that I wanted to work with eating disorders, disordered eating in some capacity as a dietitian. So
Well, that's awesome. And I love that it came from a foundation of being an athlete and having some vantage point of the eating behaviors that you were even encountering in your own team. So that's really neat. Well, tell us a little bit about what you're currently doing at the Athlete Edge program in Denver, Colorado, which
yeah.
specializes in treating eating disorders, correct?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So the Athlete Edge program is basically like a program within a larger treatment facility called ED Care. We're in Denver, Colorado. And so I work with all of the athletes that come through our program, and we have a residential level of care, PHP, and IOP. So kind of a variety of levels of care.
And
And we
what are
really
the
kind of
PHP
focus,
and ILP? Because I know people out there
yes,
listening are going to be
thank you.
like, what is the acronym?
Thank you, thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
PHP stands for partial hospitalization
Okay.
program. So they're here 8 hours a day. IOP is intensive outpatient program. So they're here for 4 hours a day and
Okay.
provide, a couple meals and snacks, or in IOP, one meal and one snack, and really focusing on kind of helping people unlearn like diet culture, but also unlearning and kind of re-engaging with more positive sport messaging in their sport. A lot of times those messages can kind of get intertwined with body image and fueling and what if I'm not exercising and all of those sorts of things. So really kind of supporting folks in returning to their values, getting back to sport if that's something that they want to do in a more appropriate way, fueling themselves and kind of unlearning some of those messages.
Well, I just love that it sounds like this center and this area is dedicated to athletes. Am I correct about that? And
Yeah, yeah. So
so they're
the
not just
EDGE
walking into
program,
any disorder facility, but it's one that's really geared toward this special population.
Yeah, it's nice because so the EDGE program is a program within like a bigger treatment facility. So our athletes like will certainly interact with kind of core patients. We have, gosh, I think 6 or 7 athlete specific groups. We have an athlete specific therapist. We have a mental performance coach. There's a strength and conditioning coach on staff for if and when like movement is appropriate. And then we have an on-site gym. So really kind of specialize, and I feel really grateful to be able to have that kind of support for athletes for sure.
Oh my gosh, and the allied professional like connections that are so critical, I'm sure, to helping recovery here. So wonderful. Well, it also sounds like you've had some research background. And tell us a little bit about your research background and how that applies maybe to currently what you're doing in practice.
Yeah. Yeah, so out of my dietetic internship, I did a sports nutrition fellowship at UNC Chapel Hill. And I had an amazing boss there. Her name's Rachel Manner. And she had been working there for at the time, I think like 7-ish years. And I remember having a conversation with her about body composition testing. And she had actually phased it out at UNC for their Olympic sports and was kind of sharing just like stories that she had heard from athletes of, comparison or feeling really worried about their results or this like hyper focus on body shape and size that was in a lot of ways like taking away from their focus on, performance or things outside of sports, right? And I was in grad school at the time and I hadn't really planned on doing research, but I was like, well, I could do that. Like I could ask athletes about like their perceptions and experiences with body composition testing. And I think it's a really oftentimes like normalized things and thing in collegiate settings. I know when I was a college athlete, we did DEXAs and body composition testing. And so I feel really grateful I was able to do that research. So really it was about asking people, and I'm happy to expand on kind of like what we found, but asking college athletes, what's your experience with this? Do you find it helpful? What are recommendations that have been made from this experience? Does it make you hyper focus on your body shape and size? Things like that. So that's kind of the basis
So,
of it.
what was the kind of outcome of that? I am curious, what their perception was, and did it help in terms of delivering to the field like critical information on how to maybe report this information to?
Yeah, I was anticipating certain results, but obviously, like, I don't know, and obviously I work in eating disorders, so I was like, I could be a little bit biased. And some of the results were pretty remarkable in my opinion. So I asked, do you feel like body composition testing or your results from body composition testing impact the way that your coaches feel about you? Uh, 70% of athletes said that they feel like it significantly, moderately, or significantly impacts the way that coaches feel about them, the athlete.
Yes, enlightening.
I asked, do your results impact the way you feel about yourself? 80% of people said that it moderately or significantly impacts the way that athletes feel about themselves. I also wanted to ask, because we had heard just like anecdotally from athletes that we had worked with, that people feel like they needed to restrict or eat differently kind of when they knew that they had a test coming up. And so I asked, do you change the way you eat? A little over a third of people said that they changed in some way the way that they ate or drank in days leading up to a body composition test. And of those people, about 60% of them said that they they decreased the amount that they ate in the days leading up to body composition testing. And then the last thing, we asked a lot of questions, but one of the other things that I thought was interesting, we asked, do you feel in general just like anxious, uncomfortable around body composition tests or about body composition tests? And just over half, around 55%, said that they sometimes, often, or always feel uncomfortable or anxious around body composition testing. And so I think, those are numbers and data, but I think, a bigger question that I wanted to kind of contribute to is like, what do we do with that information? Especially as providers and in a setting, oftentimes colleges, where that's really normalized, or coaches ask us like, hey, are you doing this? Strength and conditioning coaches might ask, what is this information? Did we help this athlete gain muscle? And so I always think about like, for me, and I'm probably a little biased, right? But I have never felt like I have needed that information to make a recommendation or to help someone in the way that
Mm,
for their goals, right? And so
right,
I think about that a lot. What am I using this information for? Is
right.
it for confirmation for me that I'm, doing my job, or is it just like a normalized part of the program? And so with that, I also think about risk, right? Like, what is the risk for an athlete? If the risk is this like hyper focus on body shape and size, are there other ways that I could help them? Is one train of thought that I go down to. So that's kind of a starting point. Happy to answer other questions too or talk
No,
more about
that
it. But
gives, I think that really kind of leads into, further discussion how just their perception of the assessment process for them and,
yeah,
what that looks like, and how they come into it and also how it affects them in receiving that information. Just, kind of following up from that, what do you feel like is one of the biggest misconceptions about eating disorders in athletics?
yeah. Surprisingly, I think a misconception is that it's less common in athletes sometimes than it is in like a general population. Sometimes I hear people say like, "Oh, I would think that athletes have fewer eating disorders." And actually, the opposite is true. They're at a much, much, much higher risk for eating disorders. So that's something that we kind of have to challenge the narrative around a bit.
Well, and you realize too, I think, as we who have come into this area of practice and spent, whatever amount of time in the field, I know for me it was quite a while before I got specialized in sport, but, we didn't have that option when I first came out. But I would say too, like you see as you start to train in these areas as a dietitian, how prevalent it actually is and the risk factors, like you said earlier, what they are, and then maybe how you can catch them earlier and help even prevent, somebody from spiraling down into eating disturbances. And understanding that there's this kind of fine line between what someone would say is disordered eating behaviors and an eating disorder. And so I kind of want to clarify that for people. Do you think there's a difference between disordered eating patterns or behaviors and an eating disorder?
Yeah, it's a good question. I always think of it like a spectrum, right? Eating behaviors exist on a spectrum. And so we have like, kind of normal, appropriate eating patterns. And then we might have disordered patterns, which are oftentimes, I think, really normalized in our culture, but also in sports. And so people making comments like, oh, I can't believe I just ate that, or oh, I didn't exercise as much today, so I'm going to need to eat differently tomorrow. Those are really normalized disordered eating comments, right? And so sometimes those go unchecked, or are just kind of like typical conversation. And then people are like, oh, yeah, it makes sense. But those are, I always like to challenge people on that. Like those are disordered comments. Eating disorders, there's, criteria in the DSM-5, right? That would kind of mark someone being diagnosed with an eating disorder. And to your point, I think the lines are really, really blurry because some of the criteria are based on things like weight. And we know that eating disorders exist in all shapes and sizes, and someone can be significantly struggling regardless of what body shape or size they're in. And so I think I always come back to if someone's struggling, they deserve support, whether or not they have a diagnosable eating disorder or not. If there's disordered eating, an eating disorder, if they feel like they're struggling, they deserve support.
Yeah. And as you were talking, I was just thinking how fortunate it is and how far we've come in developing those supportive frameworks around them to understand like where those risks and, like you said, even just, you know, the use of words or the thought processes or the triggers that might lead into more serious problems and people realizing that that's not, let's not normalize that, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, totally.
So stay with us as we take a short break and thank our sponsors. You're listening to the Eat to Win podcast with your host, Margaret Downs. Liquid Fuel is a new sports and hydration product formulated by a sports dietitian to give athletes the edge to train and compete longer. It contains low glycemic carbohydrate platinose designed to keep blood sugar levels more stable, to provide energy for 3 to 4 hours without the blood sugar crash seen in other leading sports drinks. Its unique 4-part electrolyte formula includes 50% of your daily magnesium need to optimize muscle function. Liquid Fuel is naturally sweetened, along with no artificial ingredients or colors. Currently being used by high school, collegiate, and professional teams, Liquid Fuel allows you to live life with confidence knowing you're properly fueling your body. Visit drinkliquidfuel.com and use the code MSD10 to get 10% off your order. Welcome back to the Eat to Win podcast, where we are talking with Linda Steinhardt, who is a specialist and board certified in sports nutrition, working with athletes in eating disorders treatment. So this is just a great conversation. I want to kind of go into now about a little bit how we're managing these things in our athletic settings. So, can you kind of give us some insight in terms of what surprising lesson have you learned, working in this particular area where, you came into it and you're like, I just wasn't expecting this, and maybe you got kind of blindsided by something, but what has surprised you about working with this population?
Yeah, I think when I was at UNC doing my fellowship, I was really grateful and also surprised by how willing athletes were to engage in like hard conversations around eating disorders. And so we had a lot of like Instagram posts that we did. Like that's one way that we reached our athletes. And we put out a post on during Weight Stigma Awareness Week. It was kind of talking through like ways that athletes experience weight stigma. And that was our most engaged with, most liked post by far. We got lots of messages from athletes being like, thank you so much for acknowledging that this happens. Thank you so much for, not keeping a lid on this conversation. And I think that was really surprising, but also I felt just really grateful for their openness and awareness around like, yeah, that's not normal. Yeah, we don't want that to be in our sport culture
Yeah,
or part of sports. It was really kind of great to
it
to
is
kind of see.
for sure. So, are there any industry trends in kind of managing eating disorders that you feel are misinterpreted or under researched?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one thing that comes to mind is intuitive eating. I think sometimes that, oftentimes actually, that gets misrepresented. Sometimes that can be interpreted as like, eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full, and that's all it is. And I think it's so much more nuanced than that. And it can fit really well, I believe, within like an athlete population. I think a lot of things within the intuitive eating framework actually speak really well to some sports nutrition principles that we talk about. Like, sometimes you got to eat when you're not hungry. They call that practical hunger, oftentimes in the intuitive eating world and things like that. So I think intuitive eating is really nuanced and sometimes gets kind of reduced down to that eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full kind of thing. So I'd love to see more kind of awareness around the nuances of that.
So, can you give us a little bit more insight there, because I think this is an area that maybe a lot of dietitians aren't even clear on, when we
Mm.
use that term intuitive eating. So, how do you use this in practice and what relevance does it have?
Yeah. Well, so in the book, there's 4 editions of the book. It's the most recent one is in its 4th edition, and they talk about intuitive eating as a framework for self-care. So I always talk about it as like eating for self-care. And as an athlete, right? Like we can do that. We can eat for self-care. And sometimes that involves eating when we're not hungry. And sometimes that involves eating at 5 a.m. because we know we got to work out at 5:30 or whatever, right? And the other thing it talks about is it's a dynamic interplay between rational thought, emotion, and instinct. Our eating decisions are a dynamic interplay between those 3 things, which means sometimes we're going to make decisions about food and what we're eating based on, okay, I know I have a run. And so I really feel like X right now, but I'm going to have something that's more simple carbohydrates so that I don't have GI distress, right? Like that's rational thought. Instinct is right. Like I feel hungry and like maybe I don't have stomach rumbling, but oof, gosh, I think I need something. And emotion is things like, I am going to celebrate my friend's birthday party, and having cake at a birthday party makes sense, right? And so, what intuitive eating says is like, no one thing is more important than the other. We're always kind of making decisions about food based on like a dynamic interplay between all of those things. But what we're not doing is we're not making decisions about food based on rules, based on calories, based on what our society says is, quote, good or bad, right? And that fits beautifully within to the sports world, right?
Absolutely.
There's nothing in that kind of conflicts, in my opinion, with sports nutrition principles or things like that.
Yeah, because I'm probably assuming that just knowing how busy athletes are, knowing how
Mm.
access to food can be, especially when they're in very busy collegiate environments, that they often don't even have like a hunger signal. I'm not,
Totally.
I know
Totally.
I worked with a lot of people like that where they're like, I don't I don't even think I'm hungry,
Yes.
so it kind of surpasses that
Mhm.
ability to know when to eat. But yeah, that's really, really neat. So, what do you think are some emerging trends in athlete eating disorder treatment? And what are you most excited about?
Yeah. Well, I actually love the kind of emergence of this acceptance of like this all foods fit mentality. I think we're slowly kind of getting there to not judge foods, to not say, "Oh, I can't have that because I am an athlete," like those sorts of things. I think there's been kind of a spark there where people are recognizing, athletes are at a significantly higher risk for things like eating disorders, disordered eating, REDS, and we can play a part in trying to, like you said, prevent those things if we can support athletes to get enough to eat, right? I always tell my athletes, if there's one message they take away from me, it's that I want them to get enough.
Yeah.
And so I like that that message seems to be kind of emerging more. And then one other thing I think about is kind of this transition from an eating disorder treatment specifically. There used to be a thought of like, we're not incorporating movement into treatment. But oftentimes what that might lead to is, if that relationship is kind of intertwined with their eating disorder, their relationship with movement and their eating disorder, once they leave treatment, right, they still have that dysfunctional relationship with movement. So there's been kind of a change in the thought process sometimes of if and when it's appropriate to kind of reincorporate movement slowly, right? So we can work on that relationship with movement and how it intertwines with body image and food and all of those things, which is great.
Well, that is super good. I mean, that is news to me. And I think that is absolutely awesome
Mhm.
because on that spectrum of eating disorders, when you have someone, purging through exercise and
Sure.
using
Yeah.
that as their energy, like expend. So very, very neat. Hopefully, there's also some research going on in that area. I'll definitely have to tap in, but love it. Well, I would say too, if you could design one ideal protocol for athlete body image and support, what would that include? And this kind of goes
Yeah.
back to your research, but also you mentioned some of the surprises that you even found when
Yeah.
doing that.
Yeah, one thing that research showed and also that I continue to hear from athletes just in my office is how there's like this web of body image, food, and then this like relationship with movement and how they all intertwine, right? And if I think about it like a tapestry, like if they're all interwoven and we pull one of them, then the whole thing falls apart, right? So if someone takes away movement or if they get injured or something like that, right? Sometimes the other two branches, right, body image and food can kind of suffer. Their body image distress might go up. They might feel like they need to change the way they eat. And the same is true for any of the other. So I would love to have a program that really focuses on like how they all intertwine and how we can kind of begin to unintertwine them in a way that feels helpful, right? So that people can feel confident in their bodies or at least be able to tolerate their bodies regardless of if they're exercising or regardless of what they eat, and vice versa for the other kind of two pillars, if you will.
Well, my last question is centered around kind of that interdisciplinary,
Mhm.
connection too. And so imagine that you could partner with any professional in mental health or nutrition to advance eating disorder treatment in athletes. Who would you choose and why?
Gosh, yeah, I feel like there's so many people.
Right? Like I'm curious. I'm like, is there just one?
Yeah.
You
Yeah. Well,
obviously work with a team, and that is definitely, I think, you know,
yeah.
the way to go. But
Yeah, there is a first person that comes to mind is a psychologist I worked with here, actually. Her name's Lindsay Landgrebe, and I just think she is so wonderful and has taught me so much. I feel like she's a mentor, even though she's a psychologist and not a dietitian. But in terms of treating eating disorders, in terms of verbiage, in terms of boundaries to hold when people might be kind of like asking, hey, when can I exercise? When can I do movement? Those sorts of things, and has such a breadth of knowledge.
I mean, there's so much to talk about in this area of practice. And, I know we can't underscore the importance of people like you in the field that are working with athletes and performance driven individuals who desperately need good guidance and information, education, and skill development. So thank you for what you're doing out there and all of your great work. We want to leave our listeners, if you will, your contact information, how they might be able to get in touch with you. And I know there is probably a lack of specialized facilities for this population too. So it's great to know about the Athlete Edge program in Denver, Colorado, and that there are actually resources that athletes can tap into to help them.
Yeah. So that's a great resource if anyone knows anyone or if anyone is looking for higher levels of care, you can definitely reach out to our team here. Our website has contact information. And then if anyone would like to get in contact with me, I'd give them I see a couple people outpatient in private practice. So I'll probably give them that email because it's easier to spell.
Super.
So that is Linda at fueledperformancenutrition.com. And then obviously happy to get them connected with people at Edge if they're looking for an assessment or connect in whatever way feels helpful for people.
Thank you so much. I really
Yeah.
appreciate your time and your expertise and all that you're doing out there in practice. And
Absolutely.
so we're going to wrap it up for today. And that is it for today's episode of the Winner's Circle and the Eat to Win podcast show. Big thank you to Linda Steinhardt for joining us and sharing her expertise on eating disorders and athletics. If you found today's insights valuable, be sure to like, subscribe, and review us. And until next time, keep winning.
Thanks for joining us on the Eat to Win show. Remember, every meal is a step toward victory. Until next time, stay strong and keep winning.